Hey guys, I'm FatBuddyCat, and this is a Predator 224. This is going to be something of the simplified, everyday, enthusiast version of building one of these Predator 224s, starting with the complete bottom end that you see in front of you now. It's my first time getting hands-on with one of these. I'm not going to do the full teardown. We'll start at the governor delete. I might make some mistakes in explaining a few things. Let me give you the gist of it real quick. A Predator 224 is a stroked 212. We're dealing with the same cylinder and a different crank. This crank throws the rod further per rotation towards the top of the cylinder. Whatever goes up also comes down. Stroked engines have a little more oomph behind them when they're doing that. Also, because you're doing it at the crank and not just in your rod and piston combination, you have to consider the flex that this may have as it's rotating, and it has more oomph behind it. That can carry the end of the rod, primarily the cap and the dipper, into the danger zone. That's going to happen in a couple places on this block. The most important being this one over here. The other thing we're going to run into is the clearance from the billet rod that's going on that crank. The ARC billet rods have a little bit more meat to them. All right. So when they're spinning around the crank and they come up, they do make contact with the bottom of the cylinder. We're going to grind the block itself inside of there, and we're going to get a little bit of the cylinder too. Don't be afraid. All right, like I'm going to point something out when we get in there, and it's about the relief that they have from the factory. All right, Ducar made relief at the top of the cylinder, and if you think about it, if you have that relief up here and you come parallel to it and you do a similar relief down here, as long as you're not interfering with your skirt and your rings as the piston comes down the cylinder, then everything's going to be a-okay. All your compression and everything else is going to be up above that. So our big concern is keeping the rod away from the block and the cylinder while that crank is spinning violently. Yeah, buddy. She gone. With all the dirty laundry, too. I just used a hammer and a punch. Knocked it out from the backside. I'm now going to use my tap, and I'll thread those holes for some 1/4 bolts. As long as you take your time and go in level with your tap, this is super easy to do. I'm using a shorter bolt for the side and a longer one for the top. They're both still that 1/4 thread. I hit them with a copious amount of red thread lock just before they go in. When I'm sending these bolts home, I don't go over torquing them. I choke up on my ratchet and I just seat the lock washers, and then just a little more. It's not much. Let that sauce do the talking. I'll wipe off the residual, but that's going to take a good 24 hours to really cure up and do its thing. Now I'm going to bore out my galley hole. That is the smallest one I've ever seen in a block. GX 160, 196, 212, 223, you name it, I've never seen one quite that small. It almost looks like a pilot hole, and the actual galley was never bored. I don't know, maybe that's their design. Either way, I like to get a 1/4 inch. I'm going to use 2 drill bits. I'm going to go with a 3/16 and then to the 1/4. That thing's so small, I probably could have gone with an 1/8 too, but I don't have one, so I'll make it happen. After I'm done with both of my drill bits, I go back around the edges of the hole very lightly with the round file, just to clean up any burrs that might be hanging around. I'm using a 7/16 20 tap to thread the hole that's left over from the low oil sensor. I looked it up, and the chart tells me that the appropriate drill bit for that tap is a 25/64. That's what I got. Right on the money. You can see what it took off. It's barely anything. It feels a little snug, but I don't know. I'll let science do its thing here. I might have to take the shield off. And again, the tap really doesn't have to go that deep. Yeah, I'm leaving it on. Okay, so it's working after all. I have a little bit further to go. I'm just gonna send it through once, and then I'll back it out of there. Let's see how we did. Beautiful. Look at those threads. I'm going to grab the shop vac and clean up all these burrs. I have a 7/16 20 bolt, a lock washer, and some red Loctite on deck. As soon as I clean this off, I'm going to douse these threads and I'll send it home. Not too tight, but just like those ones there for the governor removal. I knew I should have double checked. My lock washers are too small for the 7/16 20 bolt to pass through. The only other size I have that's close is way too big. So I just did next best thing. I repurposed a copper washer that was previously being used as a spark plug shim. It's a little bit softer than steel, so it has now become a squish washer for our temporarily permanent block plug here. I have a few threads coming through. If this thing gives me any guff, I guess I could get a longer bolt, send it through from the inside out, and then put a nut on the outside, probably of the nylock variety. I've done it like this before and I didn't have a problem, so I really hope we don't this time either. The next step to prepping our block is going to require a crank, a rod, and a piston. We're going to be using the ARC 3323, so that's a +2 GX200. This rod has the same crank journal as the Predator 224, and the oh boy, I'm gonna have to unwrap it. It's fresh. The wrist pin, all right, also GX200, fits this piston. Got all that information? Good. Beautiful, beautiful flat top. Here's our wrist pin, and there are the clips. We'll leave the rings safe inside the box for now. The next thing I have to do is set the rod to the crank. So I'm going to need the oil, my bearings, a vise, probably a couple pieces of wood, inch-pound torque wrench, yada yada yada. Let me get this thing set up. Here's what it looks like set up in the vise. I got my chunks of wood, squeezing on my wrist pin journal. You can see that neither one of the lobes on the crank are bottomed out. That's important because we want it sitting completely down on top of the bearing that's on the long half of the rod. If this were bottomed out, then it wouldn't be where it needs to be. I then took my cap and bearing, a little bit of lube on those, in between them, put that on, a little bit of lube on my bolts, just a drop, and right now they're finger tight. I have my inch-pound torque wrench, my 1/4 inch 12-point socket. I'm going to take these up in increments. I'm going to go 50 pounds, click, click, 80 pounds, click, click, probably like 100, 120, all the way up to 150. Then I'll back them off, and I'll go up to 170. All right? I should check my clearances, but let's just put it this way. This crank with that bearing is going with this rod in that engine. So no matter what, it's going to get set to 170 inch-pounds. I'm all torqued up. I'm now going to take this all apart. Whenever you loosen your 12-point 1/4-inch bolts. Go back to a 1/4-inch ratchet. Don't use your torque wrench. I'm going to deuce this block out real quick. Nothing heavy, not too dramatic. A little brake clean will get the job done. Everything is going to get cleaned and lubricated multiple times. These parts are good. I'll clean the piston off and the wrist pin for what it's worth. Throw a little lube on it. Maybe a little bit on the side of the cylinder. No rings, so that thing's gonna go in like butter. I'll just take it from there, and I'll see you when I have everything hanging out inside. The only thing you really have to remember is that the piston goes with that little arrow facing down, so this way. I might as well show you this little cheat code too. I'm just putting one of my clips in. It's not even where I'm going to position it when it's ready for final installation, but there it is. Now I can just place this over the rod and then send my wrist pin through. I'll leave the other clip out. That way I can, send it back out and take the wrist pin out and take everything apart and clean it again and again and again. Might save a guy a little bit of time and wear and tear on the clips. I'm just going to go finger tight first. The reason I put this in the vise, but I didn't necessarily check my oil clearance, is just to ensure that when I do bring it up to the 170 inch-pounds, that everything still moves. That way I know I have the correct bearing that goes with the rod and crank. If it wasn't the correct bearing, I would know. I'd have a good idea anyway. Okay, finger tight. We're going to try to spin it around. It can't go backwards, and it can't go forwards. If I torque those bolts, it's not going to make up for the amount of difference that we now have to remove from the bottom of the cylinder. We can't even see where our piston wants to go. Well, we can almost there. That should be pretty close to top dead center, actually. Very nice. I see why they went with the 550 piston and not something like a 570. There's just barely anything there. Okay. I could put my cam installation tool on, but it's still not gonna. If you try to center the crank, you know what I mean, we're still gonna hit. Alright, I'm gonna need a marker. Let's put a little bit of light on the situation. Okay, I ended up making 3 marks. The first one is kind of sloppy, but it's also kind of hard to get to with the marker. It's right there on the bottom of the cylinder. It's where the rod hits. What I'm concerned about is both sides of the rod, not necessarily the depth. That is not what any of that is for. I just want to know where that edge is, so when I'm removing something off the bottom of the cylinder, I don't go any wider than I have to. I just want, the rod and maybe just a hair more. The second mark is on this front section of the engine block. I'll spin it backwards here, and I'm actually barely rubbing with the oil dipper. You can hear it and I can feel it. So we're going to remove a little something there, and then way up there, you see those little dots, hash marks, what have you. We'll spin the crank back a little bit more, and right there, my cap bolt is extremely close. So it's only this part where the casting dips down. These are going to be very, very minute. I'm just basically going to scratch something on those marks so that I can get a feeler gauge in between. I want to say it's 30 thousandths minimum that we're looking for. To get 30 thousandths there, I mean, you first got to get it somewhere close and then go with it. Those two are going to be easy. This is the one that could lead to multiple installations. All right, I'm going to set up my Dremel to get it done. Our friend Nick from Nick's Mini Bikes happened to remind me the other day about the importance of protecting this bearing while you're grinding away inside these Predator 224s. He's built a couple of them. He has video of it on his YouTube channel. I'll go ahead and throw a link in there. I appreciate the reminder, so I can reciprocate the favor. Here's what I came up with. This bearing can be a pain in the butt to put tape over. Alright? There's lubricant, oil on the surface. I don't want to keep cleaning it off every time. I want to try to adhere some tape to it. Piece of cardboard. I traced this roll of electrical tape. It's just larger than the size of the bearing. I then stayed to the outside of the line that I made to get a little bit more, and cut that out. That's going to go over the bearing just like so. I have a bolt, a couple washers. That's going to go like that. Wham bam bla jam. Alright. Coming out the other side. We got some threads. I have a couple more. These are just flaps off a small cardboard box. I poked a little hole in them. 2 more washers and a nut. Hopefully I can get it all on there. I used an extension with a 10mm socket on my ratchet and a 10mm wrench. Reached inside and tightened that bolt while I held the nut. You can see how it's impinging. It's bending the cardboard. It's nice and firm. The inside, same thing. I'm not over tight, but I'm definitely pulling that cardboard right up to the face of the casting. So that bearing is completely covered. When I grind this thing out and clean it, and I got to put the crank back in, I just take this apart, do my thing, check it. If I got to take some more, pull the crank, set this back in place. We're ready to go, kid. I have a nice bright light on my workbench and a round burr set up on my Dremel. I got a little set off the Zon. I'm actually quite impressed. It's working better than the other burrs that I already had. Here we are along the bottom of the cylinder. If you look up top, you can see the factory clearance. So I'm assuming if that doesn't affect the skirt or the rings, then if we go directly parallel and do a little work down here, that shouldn't affect it either. So I'm not too scared to, climb up on that cylinder a little bit. Just not too much. Up on top, I got a little patch. I just used my Dremel to trace where my marks were, and then I just cleaned up everything in between. It's a little bit heavier where that dip is, that build up on the casting, and then a little bit lighter on the sides. Down here, I'll just rip something off. It's going to be very, very minute. We're only looking for 30 thousandths, so that's just a feeler gauge. It's got to slip behind the dipper. I'll probably go just a skosh more to be safe. It is a stroke motor, so your tolerances and things tend to open up a little bit more, a little more slop. All right, I'll keep going and then clean this thing up. Throw the crank in there. Rod, piston. Get those all covered up so they're not getting any flakes on them. I'll just have to clean this off and remove my little shield that I made. It's got some oil on it, but it still feels solid. There's nothing changing with my process in between. I'm just going water, super clean, more water, some Ajax, and then rinsing it off real good with the garden hose. Afterwards, I take the shop vac to the bearing. You hold your palm behind it when you're sucking it from this side, and it really produces a hard vacuum. It pulls all the moisture and any possible debris out. I do the same thing in all the corners. A few clean rags, and then a few drops of oil into the bearing and along the cylinder. It's very important. Those two things can start to rust very quickly. I'm going to get my internals back in, and then we will check those clearances. Everybody's back into position. I'll try to give it a spin around, and we're hitting, but it's ever so slight. Okay. I made sort of a arced relief there. I think if I just square it across, I should be alright. I guess I could throw the camshaft installation tool on, and that'll center the crankshaft so I know just how much to take. I'm only finger tight on my bolt still. Let's roll it around and check this side. Alright, I have a 30 thousandths feeler gauge. I'm still just a little tight. Alright, I have one more spot up top, which is not an issue. Sorry about that glare. Yeah, we're okay there. Alright, so I'm probably going to have to make an adjustment there and on that front side. I'll grab the camshaft installation tool, put a couple bolts in it, and see if it makes a difference. Okay, so it actually got tighter with the cam tool installed. Let's check the front of the block. I know I'm hitting at the cylinder. I'm not touching. I can't exactly get the feeler gauge. Alright, so I still need a little more off the front. The top is alright. My bolts aren't tight. I did go over them with my 1/4 inch ratchet, so I just gave them a little snug, but I didn't torque them. Yeah, okay. A little off the front and a little bit more off the bottom of that cylinder. This time around, when I was done with the burr, I switched to an 80 grit flapper wheel. I use that to really smooth these edges on the cylinder. I hit these other spots as well, just for good measure. Give this another thorough cleaning and get it back together with the camshaft installation tool, and we'll check it again. Yeah, buddy. We're going to be running the Dynacam's welded lobe 275. This is a cam that is specifically ground for the Predator 224. So it should have some distance, I believe, between the lobes and maybe a little bit of work done on the core itself. Oh, it's not easy to do with one hand. I really sealed this one up. I did not think this out. I got. Come on. Oh, are you kidding me? All right. Well, I'm in. Yeah. Wow, this is not going smooth. I'm trying not to mess up the mechanism. I guess I should just... No. The struggle is real. Okay, I guess I could put the camera down. I'm on a mission. Okay. Ta-da! So, totally worth it. See the distance between the lobes and that grind right there on the core. That should help us clear the rod and hopefully the crank as well. I'll get it in with the timing dots lined up, but first I'm going to go and spray this down with some brake clean. She's in there. Timing dots are lined up. I'll push the cam all the way in, just as if the side cover was there. Same with the crank. And we'll give it a spin. Huh. The cam just moved forward a little bit there, but I don't know. I think I'll throw a side cover on and give it a spin, but I don't think we have any interference. I'll try it out. I have 4 of the 6 bolts on my side cover. They're not torqued. We're just snug. I don't have a gasket installed. I don't want to just impinge on things. Give it a spin. All right. I'm all the way around. Don't worry, I put some lube up there. Okay. Now, I'm going to remove the side cover. I'll pull my cam out of the way. I'll torque my rod, reinstall the cam, then I'll add the side cover, and I think I have, an old gasket and a wrench ready to go. When I do put this on, I'll go ahead and torque the bolts, so I'll have to pull out a bigger, torquier, measure type wrench, and I'll set these at, I don't know, 18 for now. That's spec anyways. I took my rod up to roughly 150 inch-pounds. I'm not sure how much lube is left on it right now. It will go to 170 at some point. I'll probably check the oil clearance before my final installation. Dowels, gasket, this side cover is a little dirty right now. That's alright. The bearing's clean. We're not going to run this thing, don't worry. So this is just for fitment purposes. I'll get my cam in, timing dots lined up, cover on, and I'll see you when I have those bolts set at 18 foot-pounds. I'm pretty sure it's the lack of rings, but I'll tell you what, that is one smooth turning engine right there. There's plenty of end play. You get all kinds of slop right there. Doesn't really matter which way I push or pull it. There's nothing hitting. I don't think adding the rings and moving that piston up, that little hair towards the center, is gonna create any issues either. Okay. Now I have to take it all apart and thoroughly clean and check everything. 0.002, 0.003. All right, we're a little bit smaller than that one, and we are slightly larger than the other. I'm happy with that. That's at 170 inch-pounds. Plastic gauge, baby. It doesn't lie. I have my piston set on the rod. Both of my clips are installed, and they're turned so that the gap is opposite that relief that's on the piston. I also have my rings installed and my orientation set. None of my gaps are lining up. The arrow faces down. This is going to go into my lubricated cylinder. I'm going to throw oil all over this, and I'll be squeezing those rings with my sausage fingers, setting them down inside. I'll slide the crank in place. You know what happens then. rod bone's connected to the crank bone, right? Yeah, buddy. I have my rod set. I made sure to lubricate the bearing, the crank, the cylinder, the piston rings, the piston, everything. You can see all the extra honey down there at the bottom of the pot. I put the stock flywheel on just so we could give her a spin. Wow, that still feels smooth. Even with those rings installed. Don't worry, I'll wipe the top of that piston off with a clean rag before I'm done. Now we'll get the lifters and cam completely clean. Then I'll lubricate them and install those. Before you install your cam, be sure that your compression release mechanism is moving freely. This one's good to go. I'm reusing an ARC billet side cover that I had on another engine. It's only got a few hours runtime on it. Those bearings are still perfect. The only thing that I didn't like was the O-ring style seal that was there. It was a little bit flat, as in it was on plane with the billet and just below it in some places. It was sealed on the engine that it was on, but I couldn't guarantee that it would reseal on this engine or even the other one, since I took it off and put it back on. Either way, I don't have to worry about it. I just went over to my friends at OMBWarehouse.com and I ordered up a couple new strings of this stuff. It's not cut to length. I think this is the old one. Yeah. It's a little bit longer. Line those two ends up. Alright, so it's not much longer, but a couple inches. I'm going to start laying it in to the channel up here. I'll gently work my way around. We're not forcing it, not stretching it, and get it up to the top here. And then we're going to make a cut. There'll be a little tail there. There you go. There's my little tail. I'm going to go back over my work and make sure that I don't have anything sticking up. Alright, everything looks good. Oh yeah, it's going to make a wicked nice seal kit. Now I'll grab a razor blade and I'll cut tail off so that I can bring these two ends together. I just placed these solid dowels that come with the ARC side cover. There's 1 and 2. Make sure our timing dots are lined up on the cam. I have quite a bit of honey down there in the pot already, so I try to keep this at an angle. Just using an old filter for a kickstand. And now I have to set the end play on the crank. Side cover is going to go on. The bolts are going to get torqued to 20 foot-pounds. And then I'm going to have to add shims right here to close up whatever we have. I'm going to start with a couple of these shims. I have some that are a little bit thicker and some that are a little thinner. I'll do a thick one and a thin one for now. I'm torqued up. And she is sloppy. That's going to need at least one more thick one. There's one of the skinny shims on the left and one of the thicker ones on the right. I have two thick ones and a thin one in here now. It's close, but just a little too sloppy. It's like, do you just add a skinny one, or do you take the skinny one out and go with another thick one, so I'd have a total of 3 of the thicker ones? Yeah, I'll give that a shot. Oh, now it's too tight. It was better. Where was that before? What was it, 2.5 or 2 and a thin? I guess I could put my caliper on this and be a little more precise. Let me find out if 2 skinny ones equal 1 thick one. That would really help. Rock on. So, the skinny one turns out to be 0.002. The thick one's 0.006. That means 3 of the skinny jobs equal 1 of the thick jobs. So I just went way over doing what I did. I should have just added another skinny one. So now I'm going to do 2 thick ones and 2 skinny ones. Yeah, buddy. One more time. That's perfect. You can just barely see it move. I can hear it, I can feel it. I know what's happening. Alright, now I'm going to take it apart and then lube everything up real good, including the bearings. It's a dual ball bearing in the side cover there, and I'll seal it back up. The only difference is I'll add a little bit of red Loctite to the threads. That's it. With the bottom end all sealed up, there's only one more thing I'd like to do before we move on to the head. And that's going to be to install this ARC billet flywheel. I went with a Speedway model, and this is a 196 clone taper. So, not only will this flywheel fit on this Predator 224, it'll also fit my GX 160s, any of my GX 200 clone engines, and even a 210 that I'm working on. They're all the same where it counts. Wicked convenient. I'm going to get my crank holder tool on. I'm going to have to pull this key and then lap the flywheel onto the crank. The good pair of snips makes getting the woodruff key out of the shaft a lot easier. Just gonna grip onto it and then pry up. There you go. Just like that. I'm going to be using a fine compound for the lapping process. I'm just going to take, I'll show you, a little tiny bit. Alright, and I'm going to place that on the shaft. I'm trying to keep it away from my seal, if at all possible. We're going to clean this thoroughly when we're done. My crankshaft is locked in place thanks to my crank holder tool. Wipe my fingers off. Grab this nice new shiny flywheel that I'm going to end up cleaning thoroughly as well. And now I'm just going to lap it on. I'm going to go ahead and use 2 hands for this. Prop you up on the old torque wrench, maybe. Yep. Okay. I'm just pushing gently. Nothing too serious. Go side to side. Go to the right. Go to the left. A little more of the 2-way. I'm just going to work it like that for about a minute. Without completely removing the flywheel or adding any more compound, I now separate from the shaft. Okay, I can wiggle. And I push it back on. That's going to bring more of the compound that is there up onto the shaft in between the flywheel where it needs to be. I'm going to push a little bit harder this time. Hear that squeaking? Okay. I'm really working onto that taper now. I'm going to call that good. Pull it off. And now I'll thoroughly clean the shaft and the flywheel. I'm going to use brake clean and then soap and water. I'm using an old toothbrush. It's stained, it's not just covered in oil. I have some warm water and soap. And I'll just make sure that I get everything that's in there, the threads, and the keyway on the flywheel as well. I spun my key around so that the end that was facing out before is now facing inward. That's the side that I just grabbed with my snips. It's not going to hurt anything there. Just doing that for good practice. Little hammer. Lightly tap it. Flywheel goes on. All the key does is line it up so that it's set for the 32 degrees beyond top dead center from the factory. That's not where we're turned right now. That's just where we're locked in with the crank holder tool. When you do it without the flywheel key, you can change that setting once everything's tightened. That key doesn't do anything. I'm going to line up the 224 starter cup until that starter breaks. I'm just going to run it. So that goes right there. I'll put the nut on, and then I'm going to torque this thing to 65 foot-pounds. The 224 cup is extra deep. A little harder to reach into. That probably would have been easier on the end of my extension, which I already have hooked up on the torque wrench. And this is super easy because I have the crank holder tool. I just put my body weight down on the block, alright, my considerable bulk, and then push down with the other hand. I bet you're glad that's over with. I thought this was going to be more difficult. I really should have tried this build earlier. We're going to move on to the top end. It should go a little bit smoother. I think I have everything figured out for the most part. You never know. Things could change. Have a good night, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.
I want you to stay. I want you to stay.